Hello, I'm Solarcross, and today we are going to ask ourselves if Games Workshop is abandoning heroic scale. So I've got here just a page from my blog, because I've already written about this, and I'm just kind of using this page as a bit like a script. But I also happen to have some pictures on the blog which will explain or demonstrate what I mean by them, both what heroic scale is, if you don't know, and also evidence that they are moving away from this. So this is just something I think we might be interesting to talk about. So I am a fan, I would say, of Games Workshop's products and wargaming in general, but obviously Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Battles and all the associated products are all quite fun. But there is one thing about them that I've not liked too much, and that is heroic scale. And it is a little bit unique to Games Workshop. You don't really see other companies do it so much, or maybe a little bit like that in some of the fantasy type stuff. So what it is really is it's some people think of it as a scale, and it is called, we do call it heroic scale, not Games Workshop, to be clear. Games Workshop's never described this thing as heroic scale. I don't think they've ever called it anything really, but it has been noticed by people who buy their products, especially those that perhaps have bought into their more Tolkien, the models under the Tolkien IP, and as well as their more sort of familiar stuff from the Warhammer Fantasy Battles or Warhammer 40k. The reason is because the Tolkien stuff is all in true scale, which is, you might say, the standard industry scale for model making. This is whereas Warhammer 40k and most of those other kind of products, which are more specifically Games Workshop's intellectual property, they have generally been released under what we call heroic scale. And by we, I mean just the punters, the people that buy their products. And it isn't exactly the right way to call it a scale in a way, because it isn't so much that like 28mm heroic scale is really a different thing than true scale at 28mm. It's the proportions, not the size, if that makes sense, right? So what makes heroic scale is really big heads, big hands, and especially huge weapons. And I think the raison d'etre, the reason to be for heroic scale, was literally just to put gigantic weapons. It's for dramatic effect, perhaps, or maybe possibly just so they don't break so easily, right? And when you have big weapons, then you need big hands, and then because you've got big hands, you kind of need big heads. I guess it's something like that. But anyway, so you get these funky, weird proportions, and I'm just going to scroll down to an example of it. So okay, we've got this picture here. So I put this up on my blog, and so this is just an example. Actually, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself because what should we say? Okay, evidence. So the evidence of a shift to true scale. And I think the first time, apart from obviously the Tolkien stuff, that true scale was creeping into Warhammer 40k, at least the first thing I noticed was the release of the Primaris Space Marines to kind of replace the old Space Marines. And as you see from this picture here, this is also going to explain a little bit what is the difference between heroic scale and true scale for those who aren't familiar with these concepts. So the Primaris, there's this Primaris on the guy, he's on the left here, look, and this is up against a very comparable old school Space Marine commander. I mean, they're more or less the same kind of character, except one is Primaris, this one on the left, and this one on the right. And I think this is roughly how they scale up. So he's obviously a lot taller. That's the first thing everyone noticed about Primaris. is just they're Xbox huge. They're huge. But it's like tall, people think. But if we scale down this picture of the Primaris, so these are the same height as the one in the middle, then you can see that his proportions are actually changed as well. Then he's not got the same proportions as this one in the middle. His head is, more in proportion to the rest of his body. His sword isn't stupidly huge. The little halo thing on the top there, that's obviously smaller than this big chunky thing. His gun is a bit more sort of realistic, a bit more slender. The width is reduced a bit, and whereas, of course, this one in the middle, it looks like, wow, it looks like I don't know what that is. As big as an anvil, that is, this huge fat thing. So, heroic scale is fat, and true scale is kind of is in proportion to real human proportions. And I think this kind of picture really sort of brings out that the Primaris definitely are proportioned in true scale rather than heroic scale. That was perhaps so. This is the first thing I never noticed. Now, I'm not into Space Marines. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't ever say I am, and that's why I've never actually bought any Primaris. But fair play, they do actually look, I would say, better proportioned than the old ones. And people complained about the old ones because they weren't as tall as you'd think they ought to be for Space Marines. Right? Because Space Marines are meant to be like 8 feet tall. Whereas this chap, when you put him next to, let's say, a Acadian squaddy, then there's not much in it in the height. And so the Primaris sort of fixes that, but they've done more than just make them Space Marines taller. They've changed the proportions, and that's all to the good, I would argue. So let's just scroll down a bit, and so I haven't really noticed much changing. I'm not into Age of Sigmar or left me cold, so I never really followed most of the releases for that. So I didn't really notice too much whether the Primaris were going to be an anomaly, just the one-off flip to true scale, or whether this was going to be a more broad aesthetic reform going through the whole thing. I didn't really think too much of it, but then I did, because I kind of had an interest in doing a Vampire Counts army, even though obviously Age of Sigmar's here and I'm not interested in that. But Warhammer Fantasy Battles, it might be a dead game, but people still play it, so that's fine. So anyway, I was looking at sort of what remains of the old Vampire Counts line, and I noticed that they had some new releases. I think they're called Soulblight Gravelords or something. And so here we go. Look, this one on the left is an old, very old Grave Guard type guy, and he obviously is heroic scale. And you can see again that just how big the heads are on heroic scale. And just, the proportions are really pretty weird. But this guy on the right is a relatively new release, and he seems to be fairly typical for all of the new releases for these skeleton vampires, and the Soulblight Gravelords, whatever. So the Blood Knights, the new plastic kit for Blood Knights, and the Death Rattle Skeletons, or whatever they're called, I don't know, the zombies as well. They all have these much more natural proportions, normal human proportions, with heads which are not like super gigantic, and everything just sort of in line with each other. And I thought, oh well, look at that! It wasn't just from Primaris then. There's something else going on here. But then after that, I noticed the Acadians got a slight change. Well, it wasn't a full re-release of the Acadian Shock Troops box, but they got what was it? It was just an extra sprue to fill out some of the weapon options that weren't really in the old kit. These Cade, as you can see from this picture, which actually was originally posted to a website called warusu.org. I'm not sure who exactly made this picture, but I am borrowing it here because it's just a beautiful illustration of, again, what heroic scale looks like against true scale. And of course, this chap on the left isn't a model, that's a real person. And what could be more true scale than true life? So this is what true scale ought to look like. So, and you can see all the extremities. His torso isn't like gigantically different, the Cadian's torso. He's a fatty, but it's really, as you get to the extremities, the heads, the arms, and the feet, and especially the weapon. Look at the difference in the weapon. Absolutely massive. So, but yeah, that's again the difference between heroic scale and true scale. But if you're thinking, well, okay, from the Soulblight Gravelords, a bit of a mouthful, to the Cadians, then why did it get an upgrade sprue instead of a whole redesign? If they are switching from heroic scale to true scale. So this is a counter indication. I call this a Cadian counter indication, because when they released that box, it kind of looks like they weren't going to go the whole way, like redesign everything to be in a more aesthetically pleasing scale, at least to my eyes. Maybe you like pro scale. So it didn't happen for the Cadians yet. They only got a key, one sprue, and it had to, because that was an extra sprue, right? And the original kit was unchanged. Obviously, it had to be proportioned the same way, otherwise it wouldn't be modular, it wouldn't fit. So, but I did think, there might be a reason. They might actually have the intention of going true scale, but they didn't do it for the Cadians because of a few economic considerations. And the first thing is, if they redesigned the Cadian shock troop kits to be true scale, then they would also have to do the command box, and they'd have to do the heavy weapon teams. Otherwise, it would be, that's just what they ought to do, really. So they probably thought, well, that's going to be quite expensive because we need at least 3 molds, right? Instead of just one small one. And it might be that the Cadians just don't sell that well. So you might think, well, why get the upgrade sprue at all? But, well, of course, in the lore, Cadian's homeworld was blown up some time ago. And so I would say that's possibly an indication that they are eventually going to get rid of the Cadians. But they probably got tons of backstock, right? So this little relatively cheap to do upgrade sprue is probably just a way to try to get people to buy up the backstock. Once they've shifted enough of the old kits, they can perhaps re-release a new Astra Militarum regiment in, glorious true scale goodness. And wouldn't you know, I actually wrote this quite a while ago, but since I wrote this, we had the teaser for, what was it called? Something Octarius, a new kill team. And wouldn't you know, one of the other half of the kill team, this new kill team box coming out, is the Death Corps of Krieg, an Astra Militarum regiment. But, in pretty much, it looks like true scale, which makes sense in a way, because actually, of course, Forge World originally released their own resin Death Corps of Krieg, and they, of course, were in more natural proportions. Forge World tends to do that, and certainly the Kriegers were definitely, I would say true scale, or pretty close to it. So that's kind of my actually a bit of a prediction that came true, because of course it does look like we're going to, having done that Krieg kit, and I did see the kind of trailer for it on Warhammer Community, and they sort of went quite dug into the sprues and what's on them, and they weren't like a push fit kit, they were like a proper multi-part plastic kit that you would expect for a Warhammer 40k sort of core unit, the sort of thing they do all the time. So it probably will be followed up with, I would say, a broader, more supporting kits further down the line, heavy weapons and command boxes and all that for Death Corps of Kree, which is amazing because war. It's a much better looking. The Kriegers are a much better looking kit style. The style of them than the Cadians. Even if the Cadians were in true scale, they'd still be kind of dull. They're kind of a rip. I think aesthetically, they're a rip off of the Starship Troopers in the film. Not obviously the original book, because in the original book they all had power armor. Yeah, they were the Starship Troopers from Heinlein's book. Basically had flying power armor. They were basically Space Marines before Space Marines were invented. But in the film, they didn't have a budget for that, so they pretty much just gave them Kevlar-looking vests. They looked like ordinary soldiers, pretty much, like as you might find in the US Armed Forces or something, with these sort of helmets. And the Cadian style looked quite a lot like that. It was a bit of and not terrifically interesting, but the Kriegers, I would say, I wonder if anyone disagrees, really. I mean, let me know in the comments if you think I'm being unfair to the Cadians or whatever. But definitely, I would say the Kriegers are a better looking kit, better looking style of regiment. And there were lots of really nice looking Astra Militarum regiments in the past. So it was a bit strange that Cadians and the Catachans were the ones to get plastic and no one else did. But you know, this looks like a positive change that the Kriegers are going to be in plastic, so that's kind of awesome. Okay, so there was also one other thing. The Gaunt's Ghosts were released at the same time as the Cadian kit, and I actually haven't got a picture here, but if you go to my blog, I did do a review of the kit because I did buy it, and there are a few pictures on it actually which do show that, you know, the Gaunt's Ghosts are also kind of true scale. They're actually quite tall as well. They're not just proportioned, you know, in true scale. They're actually a little bit taller than perhaps. They're taller than my Steel Legion guys, anyway. Okay, and so then I noticed the next thing was they released the Dominion. It was kind of a box set. I think it was a new edition for Age of Sigmar. Obviously, I'm not interested in that, but they did, you know, the Orcs. I did have a look at them, and because you never know, you might like the models even if I don't want the game, right? And wouldn't you know, they're true scale too, I would argue, or something so close to true scale, you might as well say it's true scale. So here we got another picture, and this one on the left is an old Warhammer Fantasy Battles kit. Savage Orcs, an example of one made from this old kit, and as you can see, massive head, big chunky weapon, thick hands. Proportionately, that's just not how. Okay, Orcs aren't human, so you got some wiggle room there for saying, well, you know, do Orcs need to have human proportions, natural human proportions, if they're not human, right? But you know, look at the size of that head. You know, that's pretty much larger than you'd ever think. Especially look at the mouth, right? You know, he looks like he could take a bite out of his own thigh, right? Do you think you could do that? No, I couldn't. Because human mouths are just not that big. Of course, orc mouths could be different. But anyway, look at this guy at the right. Definitely, the proportions that he's got compared to the one on the left is a lot different. And it's much more like true scale. I mean, what you would think true scale might be for an orc, right? Because the head is, you know, isn't gigantic. The hands are reasonably sized, and the weapon is actually a little bit more slender, and altogether a nicer looking thing, I would say. So yeah, that was kind of the end of the article there. You can obviously find the links to my blog in the description, and also I would say I've done another number of videos comparing heroic scale with true scale. Not necessarily that was the focus of the video, but something incidentally. So that was incidental, and I've written about it as well. But yeah, so I would say there's quite a few indicators that heroic scale is on its way out, and personally, I think that's a great thing because it's just not that pretty, really. It's always one of the things that let down Games Workshop's offerings. Yeah, so that's all good, I would say. And let me know in the comments whether you think that is a good or bad thing, whether you preferred heroic scale to true scale, or even if... What else could you talk about? I don't know, think of something, all right? So that'll do for today. See you another time.